Katherine grimaced as the whip bit into her flesh again. She wouldn't scream. She would never give him the satisfaction of knowing he had almost broken her. From behind, she could hear him take a breath, preparing himself to strike again. The brute was still drunk off the wedding wine. Her doting husband. He was off balance. Sloppy. If only her father could see this. All the money in the world wouldn't sway him to marry her off to such a savage with venom fit to match his charming fangs. The whip came down again, marking her burning flesh through her ripped dress. Katherine had prayed the marriage she had been dreading would cool his grotesque, patronizing nature. They had only been married for merely 2 days, and each moment in Petruccio's presence brewed her own venom in her heart. No food was good enough for her to eat, no drink worthy enough to touch her parched lips. 20 lashes for your dress, my dear wife. They are but rags for a lady of your refinement. They age you terribly, my pet. Petruccio laughed behind a cloud of wine. I am honored to smite the offender in your honor. Katherine's fury formed a flame within her very soul, and she grit her teeth. How dare he speak to her as though she were a mischievous babe? How dare he carry her from the altar like a sack of flour? The audacity of dragging her from Padua, trapping her in Verona. As much as her tongue desired to lash back at him with the sting of the whip he so liberally used on her delicate flesh, she held her weapon still. She knew she was in far too vulnerable a position, chained down and exhausted from his latest taming, as he called it. As though she was the animal in this circumstance. Katherine vowed to keep her anger focused, use it to keep her strong under his taming. No matter what she did or didn't do, he would torment her. This she learned quickly. Her words, no matter how harsh, were met as if they were compliments. This villain from Verona would pay for every strike, every torture. Petruccio laughed again at her seemingly obedient silence. Nothing to say, my dear wife? I do adore your lovely words. Your tongue, so robust. She could hear his drunken steps fumbling along the stone floor of the small chamber he set aside as her own private prison for when she needed some very special taming. Perhaps my methods are at last beginning to produce my desired effect. Petruccio belched, satisfied with what he had done. Katherine turned up her nose, smelling the acrid stench of his drunken breath even from where she hung, weakened and freshly beaten. Weakened, beaten, but not defeated. Never defeated. Steady footsteps approached and freed her from her shackles. The servant, Grumio, had caught her as she nearly melted to the cold floor. Once again, this innocent soul had saved her from further pain. Carefully avoiding her back, he lowered her down to rest. For only a moment, Katherine lay on the stone, letting the burning of her muscles and flesh be carried away by her blood flow. Grumio eased her up to her feet. Need some help, my dear wife? For the first time, Katherine met the eyes of her tormentor and now husband, Petruccio. She suppressed her rage, controlled her desire to tear out those drunken, bloodied eyes of his, and remained silent, only watching, waiting. Quietly, she dared him to try something else, to push her further. Allow me to assist you with your weary body. Petruccio gathered up a bucket from the far corner of the room for catching rainwater and thrust the frigid contents upon Katherine's freshly whipped body. She only breathed once from the shock of the sudden chill and began to shiver on the spot. Satisfied with what he had done, Petruccio signaled Grumio and departed, leaving Katherine alone in the dark chamber. Before locking her away, Petruccio turned over his shoulder and called, Sleep well, my darling. Grumio looked back at her only once, a concern upon his face, where fresh bruises were forming. Petruccio was very generous in his special handling, it would seem. It was all for her, a warning of what he was capable of. Katherine stood still in the same spot, shivering violently from the sudden shock. There would be no sleep. She would freeze the entirety of the night, soaked to the bone in her little chamber, trapped in wedlock to a monster. No wood for fire, no warm food or drink, and no bed upon which to sleep. The one comfort Katherine took from this little chamber was that she did not have to share a bed with her husband. Despite his claims that nothing was good enough for her, not even a bed in which to sleep, she would rather sleep on a bed of nails. Somehow, she believed the nails would be more comforting. Katherine wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the evening chill intrude upon her dark solitude. No sleep, no respite from the pain of his taming. Katherine took comfort in only one thing. There would be plenty of time to think. Even as vulnerable as she was, Katherine knew she had her resources. She had her ever-growing patience. She had her tempered fury. Most of all, she had her beauty. Grumio might be a useful ally in this debacle. Poor Grumio. Ever under the heavy hand of his master, her husband. Ever the demonstration, the example of the taming to befall her, regardless of how she behaved. She was now his mistress. A servant must serve, after all. To be rid of Petruchio's vile, villainous ways would be a great boon of fate for the both of them. What then? Fortune favors the patient, or so some might say. All she had to do was wait and find the means to make her escape. This already proved to be a problem. Petruchio might seek her out. She was his wife, his property, traded at her father's behest with a hefty dowry. She could steal it all away and abscond to where no one might find her, a far-off land. Better still, Grumio might steal it away for her. He would know where Petruchio kept such things. Katherine had yet so much as glanced at Petruchio's bedchamber. Indeed, she was still very much a maiden, despite being a married woman. For this, she was thankful to whatever angels and saints had chosen to bless her in this damnation. To lose her virginity to such a beast. A pig would have been a far more suitable mate. She needed Grumio on her side. He was essential in this endeavor. She could save them both from such a foul man as Petruchio. Even then, a shadow darkened her soul. Katherine didn't just want escape. She wanted revenge. Revenge for every quib, for every lashing, for every moment he deprived her of all that made her human. Surely even Grumio, faithful, loyal Grumio, must have some venom in his heart for what his master had done to him. Katherine arrived at a conclusion. All of this amounted to one thing. Petruchio had to die. All of his riches would be hers, her dowry reclaimed, and the agony of the villain from Verona would be nothing more than a terrible memory. With all the money, she could vanish with a new name. She could be free. How was she to do it? Logically, Grumio would be the perfect one to deliver the blow. She would have him by her side, a mistress and a servant, bonded in their mutual desire for freedom from Petruchio. Or he would face a cruel life on the streets for failing to obey her order. A trusted servant in need of employment would be the least suspected. Alas, Katherine knew Grumio was too soft. She was hard. She could deliver Petruchio's death. Her hatred made her stronger in spirit than she ever thought possible. There are ways for a woman to ruin a man. Even then, she would never be able to fight Petruchio. She was too weak from the taming, little food, even less sleep. Maybe this was all part of the plan too. He wishes to keep me down so that I might not strike. Katherine embraced herself when she realized she did not need to fight him. Not at all. She giggled lightly at the idea now swimming through her mind. Poison would fit his undoing. Such a foul taste he left in her mouth. She would return the favor. There had to be poison available somewhere. She would find one. It wouldn't be long until they were back in Padua for Bianca's wedding. There, she would say a final goodbye to her sister and father. She would show all how much she revered and honored her husband. a perfect wife. All who knew her would see a wife so devoted, she couldn't possibly conspire a deed so foul for a spouse. Any strange behavior, such as desiring to leave her dead husband's house, would not be questioned. A widow in such deep grief would not raise suspicion for wanting to flee such fond memories of her dear love. Katherine had to be strong. Her heart of stone would be wrapped in the softness of silk. What a pretty thing this marriage would be for all who witnessed. Katherine would be the woman all men would wish for as a wife. None would ever believe she would soon be a widow. Outside, the black sky began to blue with the threat of a new day, another day at the mercy of her husband. Not many more horrid sunrises shall I witness from my husband's home. Katherine decided the dawn's majestic beauty would return once she was free. The door to her chamber opened, disrupting Katherine's musings of flight. Grumio had entered, carrying a tray. A light, simple breakfast was placed before her, with a glass of wine to pair. From under his arm, Grumio produced one of the dresses she had taken from her father's home, neatly bound, and ready to warm her. "Merry morning, my lady," Grumio spoke quietly. Katherine felt certain this was the workings of an order from yesterday. This was a reprieve, however brief it might be. She would be no good to him if people could see her fading away from lack of food. Petruchio wanted something from her, something that required a good image. He would get it, most certainly. "Does our master still slumber?" Katherine asked in a low, smooth voice. Grumio stiffened and dared a glance at her. Bringing Grumio to her favor might not be so difficult. The man had a heart, and she needed an ally here. Grumio met her gaze and promptly bowed his head, setting everything on the humble wooden table before Katherine to use at her discretion. Dutifully, keeping his head low, Grumio gently aided his weary, sleepless mistress to her feet with warm and kind hands enough to even surprise Katherine. She chuckled and swallowed a snide comment about a dog fetching a toy for its master. As much as it pained her. As much as it pained her to admit it, she needed him. Whether he accepted it or not, he needed her too. She would make him see. "Gentle, graceful Grumio, the brightest light Verona has thus shone upon me." Grumio blushed deeply at the compliment and backed to a respectful distance from his new mistress. "Master Petruchio has insisted you accompany the kitchen staff to market this morning, my lady." "What?" Katherine practically shouted at the insult. After what he did the previous evening, she could scarcely believe he would expect her to act like the head of the house now. "And so he wishes me now to be a proper wife," she thought. No doubt Petruchio would have an interesting taming in mind, no matter her performance now. That, Katherine decided, was all it would be, a performance. Let him think she wished to be a perfect wife. Let him never suspect. She would be but an actress playing a role. Katherine tempered her anger, letting it feed her desire for vengeance. Grumio looked around nervously at Katherine's shout. Katherine immediately softened her demeanor. With as much warmth as her freezing body and heart could muster, she smiled at her soon-to-be friend, and co-conspirator to the murder of her husband. "Very well, gentle Grumio. I thank you for your kindness." Gracefully, Katherine sat down at the table and began to savor her simple breakfast, fighting the urge to ravage the food. Even she couldn't remember the last time she had a proper meal. The cheese and bread danced upon her tongue, and Katherine found a piece of heaven while hell surrounded her. After swallowing, Katherine saw Grumio backing away for the door. "Grumio," she cooed through her food, "are you pleased with your position?" "I beg your pardon, my lady?" Grumio asked. Katherine could see the concern growing in Grumio. No servant ever wanted to appear treacherous or unhappy with his master or position. Katherine did not ask the question again. Instead, she batted her eyes and locked a soft and seductive gaze upon him. Such a handsome face under those bruises. Katherine reminded him of Petruchio's example, with what could almost be a compliment, had it not been for such a heavy-handed master. "I, for one, am quite pleased with your position. Right there in my sight, glowing with the promise of a new morn." Delicately, Katherine sipped her wine. Ever were her eyes on Grumio. She let him look at her, a helpless lady he nurtured and protected from such discomfort and potential sickness. For a moment, Katherine thought she really could love him, if she were not so full of hatred. Grumio swallowed. "I must tend to my duties, my lady. A scullery maid will arrive upon the hour to help you into your dress and escort you to the kitchen." With that, Grumio vanished, beyond the door and out of Katherine's sight. She smiled at herself as she happily consumed her meal. She had secured an ally in the house from which she would escape. Not now. The thought of fleeing while fulfilling her duties as a wife in the market had a terrible temptation for her. Petruchio probably thought she might dare attempt to abscond back to Padua, back to the house of her father. Oh, the taming she would require after such terrible behavior. No, she would play a little game first. Petruchio would be astonished by finding his obedient wife had returned, ready to lead his household with the perfection the taming had instilled in his shrew of a wife. There would come the perfect time to strike. A knock at the door disrupted her conspiring. The scullery maid, no doubt. "Yes?" Katherine called for the servant girl to enter. A young girl entered demurely, ready to receive orders from her mistress. "Wonderful. Assist me with my dress, then you may escort me to the kitchen." Half an hour later, Katherine was dry and warmer thanks to her new accoutrements. She knew Petruchio only allowed this new dress to keep up appearances in public. He was truly despicable. Be dutiful and dedicated, Katherine told herself. A tamed nature is all part of the plan. A loud clap alerted the few kitchen staff to her attention. She was in charge now. This was her domain, and they would all do well to remember. Nothing short of absolute perfection would be tolerated here from now on. Let them think her proud of her lot in life. Standing tall, Katherine exuded authority, the new commander of Petruchio's household. "As your new mistress," Katherine barked, "you should all know, I expect nothing but the best for your master. I am to accompany you to the market this morn, and I will make sure you acquire nothing but the best." Katherine marched down the short line of workers, each with their heads held low, making Katherine smile. They were on edge, and she made her expectations clear. "Enough dilly-dally. Let's away to the market." All through the morning, Katherine kept on the heels of each of her new servants, demanding better selections for their master, her tongue lashing when her orders were not followed. The workers had separated, each with his or her own task and ingredients and materials to acquire. Katherine did this deliberately, not only to save valuable time, but to familiarize herself with the market, to look around, to veer out of sight, to seek a much-desired poison. Verona had offered all manner of wares and necessities she could dream of, except the one thing she greatly desired. Feeling defeated, Katherine decided to give up for the day. She had wifely duties to attend to. Towards the end of her venture, Katherine came across a merchant like no other she had ever seen before in Padua or Verona. The man was dark in his complexion. His long gray beard reached down to his navel, wrapped in robes and sealed with a wide red sash, and his head wrapped in a matching turban. Katherine watched from afar until she noticed what he had brought out beside him. A long dark serpent, deep brown with black spots. The serpent's head was raised and expanded like the man's turban, as it held itself up to face the disturbance of its rest from wherever the man had taken it. She had never seen anything like it. "I would stay back, my lady," the merchant warned. Even his accent was like a dance to Katherine's ears. "What is it, sir?" she asked. The merchant frowned while he looked down at the threatening serpent. The snake only retaliated with a hiss as it stared down its master. "A dangerous reminder of a terrible deed, my lady." The serpent's attention shifted as Katherine dared to near, ignoring the merchant's warning. If he did not fear, then neither would she. "Be careful," One bite from this beast is enough to bring a man to his death." Katherine's interest leapt to attention, her mind shadowed by murder. The serpent's darkness gleamed in the Verona sun. "Why then do you carry such a danger with you?" The merchant sighed. "Perhaps as repentance. If death is to come to me, it is because I have let my anger, my fury consume me yet again." "A beast who will destroy your own?" Katherine asked, understanding the man. The merchant nodded. "Something like that, my lady." The serpent's head shrank and rested its body before the man. It was a normal snake once again. "I have done terrible things, and this serpent keeps me from such deeds again." Katherine knew she would get no more out of this mysterious man. Instead, she looked at his wares, intrigued by the tea made from flowers. "I will remember you, dear man. You and the lovely beast." Returning to Petruccio's home, Katherine immediately put the kitchen staff to work, prepping all the finest ingredients the market had to offer. Nothing would be too good for Petruccio. He would likely rise any moment and would demand his morning meal. Katherine already anticipated a taming, no matter how perfect things turned out. She was prepared. He would only add more hatred to her heart. "Our master awaits, my lady," a familiar voice called gently from the kitchen entryway. "Grumio!" Katherine's powerful and stern demeanor became soft and warm upon his entrance. "The meal is nearly done." Grumio turned to depart for his master's side before Katherine stopped him. "One more thing, my dear Grumio." From around her waist, secured in a tartan bag, Katherine produced a sachet of dried flowers, their heavenly aroma wafting over to Grumio from her gentle touch. "A gift for you. Flowers from the East. I have been told they are for tea." Grumio hesitated in accepting the gift from his mistress. "Let it be our secret," Katherine whispered, raising his hand to receive her flowers. The meal was placed before Grumio to take up to Petruccio. "Wait," Katherine ordered. "No meal for our master shall leave this room without my approval." With the enamored Grumio waiting, Katherine raised the cloche, revealing one of the loveliest plates of food she had ever seen. She huffed and allowed the meal to go to Petruccio. Grumio departed, and Katherine followed in his stead. Katherine felt herself go hot with fury upon seeing her husband sitting at the table, as if he were a king. "I've been waiting." "Yes, dear husband," Katherine answered as flatly as possible. "Good things are worth waiting for." Petruccio met her answer with a huff. "Sit beside me, my wife." He turned and pointed not to a chair, but to his side. Katherine was to sit on the floor. "Your precious body shouldn't have to endure the rough wood of such chairs. I'll not have it." So it begins, Katherine thought. Not even a glance upon his plate, and I am to be punished. She would endure, as she had decided. "As you wish, dear husband." Obediently, Katherine knelt before Petruccio's seat, looking up at him with submissive eyes. Petruccio chuffed at such a sight. "So much like a pup you are. Perhaps when you are as demure as a bitch, you will have my scraps." Katherine held her tongue, merely closing her eyes as she took the insult to her hard heart of stone. She would ruin him. Nothing would stop her. For a moment, she glanced over at Grumio, who looked down upon her with great pity. Distracting Petruccio's attention, Grumio placed his breakfast before his master, without waiting for his order. Katherine could see Petruccio's surprise when his plate was revealed. An astounding, perfect breakfast of nothing but the best ingredients sat before him. "This meal is grotesquely overcooked," he decided. Katherine could see it was exactly correct. She expected his insults. "Here I believed you knew how to command the kitchen staff. Such a pity. Had it been properly prepared, I might have thought to share it with you." Without another word, Petruccio began to consume the gift of airs from Katherine. She looked away, disgusted by his shameless indulgence. Petruccio was halfway through the perfectly cooked breakfast when he spoke again. "I have received word this morning We are to Padua on the morrow. Your sister is to wed, sooner than we expected. Bianca. She was the only reason why she settled for this awful man. Katherine lost herself, believing no man could ever love her in her wild ways, so that Bianca might find happiness with a new husband. To think she once believed Petruchio witty and playful. It was all too late before the monster revealed itself. This felt like a lifetime ago. Any interest, passion, or dare she say, love, had vanished. Petruchio's mask had slipped. I shall prepare a carriage, dear husband. Petruchio laughed around a mouthful of tender meat. See that you manage to put the horses in front, dear wife. The road to Padua was a long one. The journey made all the more dreadful for Katherine by the mere fact she was forced to walk it all on foot. The carriage was not suitable enough for her. The linens were too rough, the seams too uneven. To have Katherine, his dear wife, sit on such despicable cloth would have been an insult to her. Thus, Katherine walked the miles to her former home, missing the simpler days of life in her father's house. Padua was reached by the second nightfall. Katherine collapsed upon the steps of her father's home, exhausted from her exertion. Grumio rushed to her side, lifting a cup of cold water to her parched lips. Katherine felt at ease by the touch of his warm hands, gently lifting her, helping her to be strong. How many times had he lifted her up to her feet after one of Petruchio's unique forms of torture? She had lost count. Even in this dark time, so shines your star, dear Grumio. Katherine shocked herself with her own words. Grumio, too, nearly fumbled Katherine as he helped her up. You are exhausted, my lady. You know not what you say. My dear wife, Petruchio jumped out of the carriage and practically danced before her father's house. We have reached Padua before the rise of the moon. Through her fog of exhaustion, Katherine answered back, believing Petruchio had made a foolish mistake. Surely you mean the sun, my dear husband? Petruchio was jovial at the sight of her weakness. Not at all, my wife. What shines brighter in the day than the light of the moon? Another test. Katherine surrendered, swallowing her venom. Very well, dear husband, if you please to call it a rush candle. Henceforth, I vow, it shall be so for me. Petruchio raised his eyebrows, looking down upon his seemingly defeated wife. Very good, then. Let us to the festivities. Fighting to stay on her feet, Katherine took Petruchio's arm and entered her former home. There, before the crowd, stood Bianca and her father. Katherine fought the desire to throw herself into their arms, to surrender and apologize for all her wrongdoings, for all her faults which set her on this course. Things could have been so different, if only she had learned to temper her anger, her wild ways. Despite her sudden heartbreak, she clung to the husband who repulsed her so thoroughly. She iced over her heart and swallowed the dry tears her eyes were too tired to make, knowing her path was set. She was soon to be a widow, and this was to be her last time she would set eyes on her father and sister. Here, now, she was to be the elder sister, happy in her sister's marriage. A shrew in a shadow. That was what she must be. Bianca had been confused by Katherine's peculiar behavior. Katherine had held her tightly in an embrace, something she had never done before. You are so thin, Bianca declared. My poor sister, what is the meaning of this? Katherine ignored Bianca's concerns, meeting her queries with a kiss on her forehead. Dear Bianca, she began, allowing a little warmth for her sister's nuptials. Let yourself be merry. Keep your life for yourself. Love our father enough for both of us. Bianca looked confused and concerned. Katherine knew what she was saying would provoke such a reaction in her younger sister. All the same, this would be their last meeting, and Katherine wanted her to remember her requests. I don't understand why you speak as though you were on your deathbed. My dear sister, Katherine pleaded, death is a visitor uninvited to your nuptials. Let him not visit you for yours as he did mine. I am not the sister you once knew. and never will be again. Rejoice for the new woman who stands before you." "Lady Katherine, Lady Bianca," a maid from their father's house interrupted what would be the final goodbye between two sisters. "Your husbands call for your presence." Bianca blinked, bringing herself back to the moment. Katherine embraced her once again, knowing she had shaken her sister to her core with her unusual behavior. Leaving her in the quiet room to gather herself, Katherine left to go to her husband, ever the dutiful wife. Petruchio had been quite pleased with the winning wager. Katherine couldn't believe how many times he had counted the money he had won through her obedience. As a reward, Petruchio had allowed her to join him in the carriage for their return to Verona. "My dear wife," he cooed, "you are truly all I had hoped you would become. When we return to Verona, I shall honor you in my house, and we will at last be as husband and wife should be." Katherine felt the bile rise in her throat at such an idea. Would that she could leap out of her skin. "This is cause for celebration, my dear husband." Katherine tried to smile through the vitriol ever rising. "As your wife, I insist upon making a meal for you, all of my own, something unlike you've ever experienced." Petruchio returned the believed warmth in Katherine's demeanor. "My dear wife, I insist you join me at my table." "Then you will join me at last, in bed." Fearful he might hear her heart as it leapt at his suggestion, see her skin turn as white as milk, smell the vomit she contained in her stomach, Katherine sought desperately to contain her disgust. She clutched her breast, hoping he would interpret her reaction as excitement. Katherine forced her voice into softness and met his eyes. "I cannot wait to surprise you, my dear husband." Leaving the carriage that morning, Grumio approached Katherine in the most unorthodox of ways. "My lady," he whispered to her, walking beside her, "I cannot allow this. You should know. I am very much in love with you. Lord Petruchio may be my master, but I cannot take the cruelty he has displayed towards either of us, and I won't let him have you now. Just speak the word. Speak the word, my dear lady, and I am yours." Katherine was taken aback by Grumio's confession. Yes, the plan had been to sway him to her favor, not to have him fall in love with her. All the same, Katherine felt a lift in her spirits. A light was beginning to shine upon her heart. To her joyous surprise, she found she felt a love growing for him in return. Never had a man spoken to her with such sincerity, such bravery. She was a married woman, to his master of all people. Yet this did not stop the feelings she planted from growing. When were the seeds planted inside her? When did she really begin to see a light shining within Grumio? "I confess," she whispered, peering over to make sure Petruchio did not hear them. "You have changed me, gentle Grumio. I had believed my heart hardened to love, but all through my trials, pains, and misery, with this husband, has shown me I am able to love." Katherine knew she spoke the truth. She never knew how much she loved her father, her sister, her home, and least of all, Grumio. He had shown her nothing but kindness since they met. He was the only one who aided her after Petruchio's foul treatment. He suffered alongside her. "Meet me tonight, in the market. I might have a plan to free us. Harden your heart, my dear. We walk the path of death." Katherine alone marched through the early morning market. Her previous visit had proved to be useful, as she had expected. No one from the kitchen had suspected anything of her strange demand to let her and her alone cook for her husband. No one questioned her insistence on going alone to find the best ingredients. No one questioned when she insisted the servants not be in that night. She demanded perfection, and she demanded only her touch for a meal meant for her and her husband. It was the beginning of something beautiful, and Katherine wanted it done her way in her household. Better still, no one questioned why Grumio had to depart on special orders. He stood waiting in the gathering light of dawn for Katherine, the married woman he loved. Katherine smiled upon seeing him waiting in the fleeting shadows, the sun flirting with the horizon. He truly did bring the light. "My dear," she cooed, "you found exactly where I desired to be." "Your instructions were quite clear, my darling lady." Grumio furrowed his brow in curiosity. Before them was a dark merchant, staring down a darker serpent. "Why are we here, my beloved? This is most peculiar." "It is as I've told you, my light. We are to commit a dark deed for our own freedom." Katherine approached the strange merchant, knowing Grumio would follow. He would always follow her now. Of that she was certain. The merchant stared down the serpent, its hood spreading wide again as it stared back. "You've returned, my lady," the snake hissed. "You've come seeking death, not for yourself, but for another." Katherine nodded. "You've killed before. You have poisoned someone with your serpent." The merchant said nothing, merely watched the snake coil. "I seek to be free of a foul fool. I need your aid." The merchant stayed quiet. Katherine could hear Grumio shifting uncomfortably behind her. She knew he would stay. What she feared was what the merchant might say and do now. "You seek to carry a terrible burden with you, my lady. There is much darkness in your heart, fury in your blood." The serpent retracted its wide hood and began to slither towards its master, up its arm and around the man's throat. "This venom would destroy you if you cannot control it. I will help you to take this life, but it will be up to you to control your hatred and anger. This," he warned, pointing to the serpent constricting around his throat, "will make sure you do, or it will destroy you just as easily." Petruchio had proven himself useful, Katherine had to confess. She had been a wild, angry shrew. His taming had not rid her of these faults. Rather, he had taught her how to channel them. She was calmer. She was harder. She was able to walk through his home with murder consuming her thoughts, and he believed she loved him. One life for the freedom and bitter vengeance of two was a small price to pay, a burden she would happily wear upon her for the rest of her life. "I understand, sir." Katherine outstretched her arm to the dark serpent, death in the flesh. A long hiss emanated from the creature. Katherine held at her arm and calmed her thoughts. If the serpent poisoned her now, she knew she would still be free. The only thing she wanted now was revenge. She had already surrendered everything she cared for. There was only going forward. Life, death, revenge. The fires burning in her blood soothed, and the serpent claimed its new master. Hidden in her cloak, Katherine brought death into the house of her husband, her lover now by her side. The wine poured enough to float a ship that evening. Petruchio was a man pleased with a well-tamed wife by his side, all the richer for it. Katherine worked away at her meal for her dear husband. To celebrate, she created her own favorite dish, 2 plates for a happy couple. Ever dutiful, Katherine made sure the dishes were perfect before being presented before her husband. "A meal to die for," she proudly proclaimed. Grumio brought out the 2 covered plates. Petruchio stood and raised a wineglass to Katherine. "At long last, I can proudly call you my wife." Drinking deeply, he drained the glass and slammed it next to his plate. A hiss echoed from the table. "Did you hear that, my dear? Sounded like a hiss." Katherine smiled. "The beginning of our history together, my dear. Your dish is quite ready, it seems. Best eat it now before it cools." Petruchio laughed and fell back into his chair. "Indeed." Grumio stepped back as Petruchio unveiled his final meal. The dark serpent struck thrice upon Petruchio's face. Each met with a painful shout, infuriating the serpent further. Once Petruchio fell to the floor, unheard by the absent servants, the snake calmed and slithered across the table. Grumio watched as his master struggled in terrible pain on the floor, his blood solidifying in his veins as the seconds passed. Katherine sat at the other end of the table, sipping her wine. "The fool hath run foul." After dabbing her mouth, she rose from her seat to stand over her husband. The marks left by the serpent were already swelling. "All the venom you have pierced into my blood. The threat of your serpent upon and within my body. How could I not return the favor?" She looked to the table, the serpent spreading its length across the wood. Petruchio moaned and coughed, unable to speak. Katherine smiled, watching her husband take his final breath. "I like the way you sound when you have nothing to say." Petruchio groaned, stilled, and never moved again. Katherine returned to her seat and began to savor the meal she had prepared. "Grumio," she called to her lover. He was white as a ghost and looked near to fainting. "My love, take your former master's seat and join me in the meal I've made for the two of us." Grumio watched the serpent slither freely amongst the plates and silverware. "My lady, what about the 'let the angel be'?" Katherine answered. "The poor dear has outdone itself and should enjoy some freedom." Grumio followed her orders and sat in Petruchio's place, his body motionless under his feet. His hands visibly shook and struggled to take up the fork next to the plate. He was careful to avoid touching the snake, lest it turn on him. Somehow he managed to work up the nerve to sit opposite of his lover, his partner, the one he said he would do anything for, and had. Taking a bite of the food on his plate, Katherine could see his fears and agitations melt away. She knew this was the most perfect, tender meat either of them had ever had. Darkness had been their savior. The night was clear, warm, and perfect for a late-night carriage ride. All was calm in Verona. So calm, no one noticed when Grumio and his mistress took the road south and disappeared into the shadows. Around her neck, Katherine carried the serpent. Grumio had insisted on returning the creature to the merchant, but Katherine had insisted it was her burden to bear now. The serpent had chosen her as its new master. She knew what she had done, and she knew she had to keep her anger, her wild nature, her darkness in balance. The serpent would ever be a reminder. Control it, or be poisoned by it. For miles they traveled. For days they headed south. Katherine knew they had to go far as Petruchio's winning wager and Katherine's reclaimed dowry could get them. When they ran out of land, they took to the sea, bound for the old world of myths and philosophers. The sun began to rise over the wide sea. The horizon revealed their final destination. Gazing out at the promising new life to them on the land coming ever closer, they both sighed in relief, and the serpent slumbered around Katherine's throat.